What's up everyone, it's ENDYMION, and there's been this growing controversy surrounding the company Ubisoft, as well as how they're being blasted for telling customers that they should get used to not owning their games. This statement has of course blown up in their faces, but there's some worryingly accurate evidence that points to the fact that modern gaming is likely heading in that direction regardless, to varying degrees of course. But there's one person in particular who's gone ahead and blasted Ubisoft over their comments. That person is Sven Vink, the director of Baldur's Gate 3, and Vink represents a particular anomaly within the modern gaming space, as he's someone who not only believes streaming platforms replacing physical gaming media, or relegating everything into subscription services to be nothing short of catastrophic. We need to remember that Vink owns Larian Studios alongside his wife, and they are a privately owned company. This is why Larian can comfortably sit outside of a lot of the nonsense going on a daily basis over there in the video game sphere. Most of these companies, like Ubisoft for example, are all publicly traded companies. So naturally, they need to constantly answer to shareholders when it comes to what they do in the future in order to make profit. Larian, however, like I said, is privately owned, so unlike Ubisoft, Larian answers only to Vink and his wife basically. They can take all the time they want making their games as long as their funds don't run out. And seeing as how Baldur's Gate 3 became more popular than Jesus in 2023, I think it's safe to say Larian will keep doing what they're doing just fine. But what did Ubisoft say exactly, you might be asking? This all started when Ubisoft's director of subscriptions, whose name is Philippe Tremblay, was interviewed about what he believes needs to happen in order for services like Ubisoft Plus to take off and become profitable. In case you don't know, Ubisoft Plus is like Xbox Game Pass or PlayStation Plus, but it's only Ubisoft games obviously. Anyway, Philippe Tremblay said, and I quote, "One of the things we saw is that gamers are used to, a little bit like DVD, having and owning their games. That's the consumer shift that needs to happen. They got comfortable not owning their CD collection or DVD collection. That's a transformation that's been a bit slower to happen in games. As gamers grow comfortable in that aspect, you don't lose your progress. If you resume your game at another time, your progress file is still there. That's not been deleted. You don't lose what you've built in the game or your engagement with the game. So it's about feeling comfortable with not owning your games. I still have 2 boxes of DVDs. I definitely understand the gamer's perspective with that. But as people embrace that model, they will see that these games will exist. The service will continue and you'll be able to access them when you feel like. That's reassuring. I don't have a crystal ball, but when you look at the different subscription services that are out there, we've had a rapid expansion over the last couple of years, but it's still relatively small compared to the other models. We're seeing expansion on console as the likes of PlayStation and Xbox bring new people in. On PC, from a Ubisoft standpoint, it's already been great, but we are looking to reach out more on PC, so we see opportunity there. Streaming is also a thing that works really well with subscriptions, so you pay when you need it as opposed to paying all the time." End quote. Obviously, Philippe sees streaming as the future, and if you've ever watched my channel about similar stuff, you know that I believe subscription services like Xbox Game Pass and PS Plus, I don't believe that they are the future of gaming, and the more people embrace them, the worse gaming in general will become. It comes down to simple economics and the spirit of human beings really, since, let's say hypothetically, that you and I were both tasked with making a game. If both of us knew that our game would be put on Game Pass, we already know from the get-go that our future is pretty comfortable. In terms of whether the game you or I make doesn't do well, we still get paid and can probably live long enough until we make our next game. But because of this, that level of security will enact another human trait, which is of course that of laziness or complacency. It's why many people who were born with a silver spoon in their mouths oftentimes are useless and don't know how to do much, since they've grown accustomed to mommy and daddy giving them everything they need no matter what. As for those of us, like myself, who don't have that luxury, naturally we understand that our success in this world is not guaranteed. And in order to strive for greater plateaus of monetary gain, we have to push ourselves. What I'm getting at here is when games are just relegated to a streaming service, the quality mostly doesn't matter. Whether you hate to admit it or not, many of Xbox Game Pass's games are of lower quality when compared to their competitors. But this is because there is no incentive to make genuinely great games, since the products being made aren't really ever getting sold per unit and instead can just be played and forgotten about on Game Pass. The traditional model of releasing games, however, is of course you pour your heart and soul into it and try to make it the best thing you can possibly make. And then if it's good enough and audiences resonate with it, your ability to make gangbusters and reach critical acclaim are things that can genuinely happen. A good way of looking at this silver spoon versus make your own fortune mentality would be to compare two games from last year. One being Starfield, which would be the silver spoon analogy, and the self-fortune one being Baldur's Gate 3. Starfield was never going to be a great game because it was destined for Game Pass, and clearly with its mostly negative reviews on Steam, and the fact it was largely ignored come awards season proves this. It was easily, as many other people online I'm sure have told you already, is Bethesda's worst mainline game in years. But that's because it was made for a streaming platform. It was not really meant to be sold per se to users for money. Sure, it was released on Steam, but again, the fact a game made for streaming was sold at full price on Steam, well, those user reviews tell you everything that you need to know about its quality. The game wasn't meeting that bar of quality for its asking price, and when compared to other offerings around it being sold for the same amount of money, it was clear that Starfield was not measuring up to the greatness around it. Then you have Baldur's Gate 3, which is the epitome of making your own fortune, of not having that hypothetical silver spoon, as you would say. If BG3 flopped, it would realistically shut down Larian Studios, lay off hundreds of devs, and cost Vink and his wife a fortune in the process. Unlike Starfield, BG3 had to shoot for the stars because so much was riding on its success. And because of that very real situation of this game could make or break us mentality, it's why Larian was able to over-deliver really in every regard when it came to BG3. Cinematically, character choice, level design, customization, no microtransactions, no bullshit to streaming, none of that nonsense. It had to be a complete game when you bought it at release. Sure, the game was in early access, but the reality is the majority of people who did play BG3 likely played it once it was out of that early access period. And when you compare the scope and depth of BG3 for full price against other games around it, it's night and day for good reason. BG3 could never be a game made for a streaming service first like an Xbox Game Pass or Ubisoft Plus, because the fundamental core value and breadth of content would have no reason to be as good as it is if all it was destined to be was getting dumped on some subscription service. Of course, I'm not saying that in a few years maybe BG3 eventually joins these services once it's made all the money in the world already, but according to Vink, who again directed the game and owns the studio, he never wants that to happen. And actually, Vink responded to Philippe Tremblay's opinions on the whole gamers should get used to not owning their game statement. Vink said via Twitter, and I quote, "Whatever the future of games looks like, content will always be king. But it's going to be a lot harder to get good content if subscriptions become the dominant model and a select group gets to decide what goes to market and what not. Direct from developer to players is the way. Getting a board to okay a project fueled by idealism is almost impossible, and idealism needs room to exist. Even if it can lead to disaster, subscription models will always end up being cost-benefit analysis exercises intended to maximize profit. There is nothing wrong with that, but it may not become a monopoly of subscription services. We are already all dependent on a select group of digital distribution platforms, and discoverability is brutal. Should those platforms all switch to subscription, it'll become savage. In such a world, by definition, the preference of the subscription service will determine what games get made. Trust me, you really don't want that. TLDR, you won't find our games on a subscription service, even if I respect that for many developers it presents an opportunity to make their game. I don't have an issue with that. I just want to make sure the other ecosystem doesn't die because it's valuable." End quote. Vink speaks truth here, and clearly nobody can really attest him and say he's wrong, when his team just delivered what is arguably one of the most celebrated RPGs of the past 10 years. And its popularity is still at levels comparable to when it was being released today. And that one part where he says, in such a world by definition the preference of the subscription service will determine what games get made, trust me, you really don't want that, that part is very, very important, by the way. Because that ideology within the confines of modern gaming is how things like live service nonsense and games like Starfield end up getting made. For example, Starfield has no land-based vehicles, as of the making of this video anyway. You land on a planet and you have to run and boost yourself everywhere you go. Even the barren, lifeless planets which may have one or two things on it, players will have to boost and run for minutes at a time until they reach their destination. Obviously, something that could immediately remedy this problem would be a land vehicle, a car, or maybe a space booster bike. Anything really would be better than what's already there. And the only reason the game doesn't have those options is not because Bethesda didn't have enough time to implement it or something. After all, Starfield has been in development for almost a decade by the time it was released. The real reason is because the game was made for Game Pass. And that model only gets paid when the next billing cycle completes itself. In order to ensure Starfield lasts longer, it has to, in an artificial sense, waste your time, so Bethesda made the conscious decision to not have vehicles in there on purpose. Because if 1 million players or more are all running mindlessly on some barren planet and it takes them 5 minutes or more per planet to reach their destination, and then you multiply that time wasted per player paying the subscription to play their game, that time wasted will of course balloon playtime immensely, which will hopefully cause players to take longer in order to beat the game or just do things within it. And the more time is wasted, this ensures your billing cycle will repeat, which means Microsoft, who owns Bethesda, ends up getting paid. Design decisions like this are not made for any other reason than to waste your time. You think Bethesda doesn't know not having land vehicles hurts their game's experience? They're not stupid, they know that. But they also know they won't make as much money if you can complete every barren, lifeless planet within a minute or two if you have the convenience of transport. It's also why largely I've been rejecting many live service games lately as well for the most part. I used to play Destiny 2 a lot, but these past few months I've all but rejected the game. And that's because games like Destiny, MMOs, hell, even free-to-play games like Fortnite, they all exist to take way longer than they need to in order for you to get what you want. Because the longer you play, the more likely you are to, say, spend money on cash shops or buy expansions. Or in Game Pass's or Ubisoft's case, spend way more time than you should be spending in order to complete these games. A good example of a game made for streaming by Ubisoft recently is their Avatar game. I tried to play it, I probably put 20 to maybe even 30 hours into it, and I just gave up. The game looks nice, sure, but the world is just obscenely huge to the point that it ruins the experience. And the majority of what you're doing is the same thing over and over again. There's no variety in terms of what you can expect to happen. There's barely any enemy types. The world map is just littered in the same things constantly. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora is the epitome of a game that was made for quantity over quality. It's also the perfect Ubisoft Plus or Game Pass-esque game, because it's something a user can play mindlessly for hours on end and will take well over 100 hours for them to complete and see everything. Which is great if your source of income is based on subscription services. But because of that, this inadvertently forces games to be made into these nonsensical repetitive grindfests. Which of course doesn't only hamper their Metacritic score or user reviews, but it dilutes the genuine quality of these games as well. Avatar could have been half or maybe even 1/3 of the size it was, and they could have filled it with cool stuff to do, but if they did that, people would beat the game within a reasonable time frame. Sure, the Metacritic score would probably go up, but what about those subscriptions? How do they keep people playing and paying on these subscription services if the experiences on offer aren't infinitely replayable or offer loads of bloated content? It's why I believe games like God of War Ragnarok or the recent Last of Us Part 2 remaster both have roguelite modes included now. It's to increase playtime, sure, but if these games were to ever come to, say, PS Plus or something, then Sony has just likely increased their potential for more renewals due to the replayability of those features. My fear is that a lot of games are going to reject the concepts of quality and bank fully into the quantity side of the argument. And like Vink of Larian Studios said, you do not want that. Because if quantity becomes paramount and size matters more than anything else, then games like Baldur's Gate 3 will never exist ever again. And everything will just become a Starfield Avatar Frontiers of Valhalla Part 2, where you just mindlessly grind forever and waste your time on things that could have easily have been completed in 1/4 of the time it took you to do it. Like, for example, recently I've been playing Star Ocean Second Story R on my PS5 and I love it. Sure, it's a remake of a PS1 game, but I was able to complete my first run of that game in about 30 hours. And now I've beaten the game a second time with the party members I didn't recruit in the first playthrough in just under 8 hours again, mostly by skipping cutscenes I've already seen. But the point is that Star Ocean 2 at least isn't a very long game, and I honestly love that. It respects my time and it gives me a complete experience without wasting it with nonsensical backtracking or stupid shit like running forever like in Starfield or collecting crap forever like in Avatar. You get in, you experience a compelling story, you feel something, and boom, you're out. But a game like Star Ocean 2 is really bad if you want people to pay via subscription models, of course. Because in that case, Star Ocean 2 should be like 200 hours long. And every dungeon can't be short and concise, but instead it must be a massive sprawling nonsense simulator in order to boost up those playtimes. It's why PlayStation's first-party games in general reject the whole massive playtime thing mostly when compared to something like Starfield. By the time you finish Starfield, you could easily finish 3 or 4 PlayStation first-party games, and that might seem like a gotcha against PlayStation, but it really isn't. I don't know about you, but I'd rather enjoy 3 or 4 complete experiences that respect my time and money than play one bloated monster where I can't remember a single quest or character from it myself. But then again, I didn't grow up playing stuff like live service games. My old ass grew up on games like Final Fantasy VII, Super Mario World, Hoshigami Ruining Blue Earth, Suikoden, Pokemon Yellow, and classics like Mega Man X. And you could probably beat all of those games I just mentioned to completion and still not be done Starfield or Avatar slop Tears of Pandora who gives a shit. It doesn't mean those games are better in any way either, but I think what Ubisoft is pushing for here is the antithesis of what we need in gaming. I don't want the next Ass Creed to be the size of an entire country if it means all I'm doing is the same shit over and over. I actually enjoyed Mirage for the simple fact that it was much smaller than previous titles, because it proved that I could still have fun in a game like that without spending my entire life trying to complete it. And take it from a guy who has the Platinum Trophy for Ass Creed Origins, Odyssey, Valhalla, Syndicate, and Mirage, I found Mirage to be very fun to play myself. You could beat Mirage like 5 times by the time you completed Valhalla's story alone. That's ridiculous, dude. But again, a game like Ass Creed Valhalla is great if you want to charge your customers monthly, because it'll definitely take them a long ass time to beat since that game is long as hell. And this push for digital mostly in terms of gaming will lead to a future where the bulk of everyone's libraries are no longer physical. Which may seem cool, but let's say for whatever reason you end up getting banned or your account is hacked. You now no longer have access to any of your games anymore. And in terms of what Ubisoft's Felipe Tremblay said about how, oh, you can just sign in and play whatever game you want is also bullshit as well. Because we all know when it comes to these streaming services, there's plenty of games that end up leaving these platforms eventually all the time. How many times have you seen a post on social media or something where Xbox, PlayStation, or whatever says, oh, you better play this game on our service because it's leaving on this day? With that very real and often occurrence, how the hell are you supposed to play everything or come back to something if things can be removed at a moment's notice? That strengthens the realistic and unfortunate truth that yes, players will inevitably be living in a future where they genuinely do not own any game they buy anymore either. And of course, studios want you to buy games digitally as well. Why, you may ask? Well, if you own a game digitally, it's obviously much harder for you to sell or return the game. I remember back in the day when EA tried to put multiplayer access codes within new copies of their games, and these were one-time use only. So if someone sold the game to someone else, or they borrowed it, or they traded it into some store for credit, when someone ended up buying that game used, they'd have to fork over another $10 at least just to activate the game's multiplayer. And that practice stunk, it was terrible, but if everyone buys digital only, then studios no longer need to worry about their games getting sold. However, you could also run into another problem where licenses run out and games are removed from storefronts. And if you don't have the game already downloaded prior to this, you lose access to something you already paid for. For example, take the Transformers War and Fall of Cybertron games, which are awesome by the way. They're some of my favorite Transformer video games of all time and you should definitely play them. But just kidding, you can't anymore. Well, unless you have a physical copy of those games, that is. Because back in 2018, Activision's licenses for those games expired and then they refused to pay to renew them. So those games were removed, including their remastered versions, from all digital storefronts. So if you bought the game like I did digitally and deleted it at some point and wanted to play it again in the future, you can't anymore. And what about the money you spent on that game? Can you get a refund for it? Nope. That money has disappeared into the void, and now Activision has your money for a Transformers game you can't play anymore because it's gone. And that wasn't the only time they cucked me either. The same thing happened with the remasters of Marvel Ultimate Alliance 1 and 2 as well. So if you bought those games digitally and deleted them for space or something, well, surprise again. You can't access those games either, even though you paid for them. This is the future that these companies want, by the way. You will genuinely not even own the games you paid for, and you will be happy for it. And if by some chance they do return, those companies can just put those games behind new paywalls or subscriptions. So now you have to pay again to play a game you bought already because screw you, that's why, and you have no power or say in any of this. Don't you love modern gaming, dear viewer? And that's the future of Ubisoft's Felipe wants, by the way. They want all of us to not even own the things that we pay for anymore. It's just a glorified rental service. That if for whatever reason, if your account gets wrongly flagged or something, you could lose thousands of dollars in games you don't really own anyway. So ultimately, you have two ways that this can all go down in the end. Either you embrace the Ubisoft Game Pass PS Plus model and you owe nothing yet still have to pay every month to play games designed to waste your time and give you diminishing returns constantly, or you can buy games that respect your time while rejecting the shit that doesn't, like Baldur's Gate 3 for example, or anything From Software has ever made, and enjoy great games that value your time and reward your payment with quality over quantity. We're standing at a crossroads where many publishers want everything to look and play like Starfield, while many players, like myself, would rather play things like Star Ocean, Elden Ring, or Baldur's Gate instead. The future of modern gaming is a nebulous and chaotic one, but we need to keep these people accountable and speak out against them, or we could very easily fall into a future where we own absolutely nothing, and we must pay monthly for everything while enjoying things designed to waste our time while offering subpar quality, because trying to make anything good anymore doesn't matter because it'll all be relegated to a streaming service anyway. We can't allow this future to happen, and I implore you to speak out against it and to vote with your wallets. As always, I thank you for watching. Consider liking, subscribing, and maybe sharing this video so others get informed as well. Thanks to my patrons for supporting the madness, and I hope you learned something, and all I ask is that you have a wonderful day. Take care of yourselves, enjoy good video games, and thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.